On a cool, sunny morning in the small, quiet town of Willow Creek, life seemed as ordinary as ever. Birds chirped, leaves rustled softly in the breeze, and the air carried the earthy scent of autumn. For Emma and Claire Thompson, this was just another day to enjoy their favorite activity, jogging together through the winding trails near their home. The sisters were inseparable, each other's closest confidant, and their bond was something everyone admired. Emma, the older sister, at 24 had a thoughtful demeanor. She always carried a notebook in her pocket, jotting down ideas for stories she hoped to write one day. Her dreams often revolved around adventure, but her heart was firmly rooted in family. Claire, only 20, was the opposite in many ways. Vibrant, spontaneous, and full-hearted, she loved painting landscapes and capturing the beauty of nature on canvas. Their personalities complemented each other perfectly, making them not just sisters but best friends. That particular morning, they left the house shortly after sunrise. Dressed in matching jogging outfits, they waved goodbye to their parents from the porch. "Back before breakfast," Emma called out with a smile. It was a promise they made every time they went out, and it was one they had never broken until now. Their usual route took them through the dense woods surrounding Willow Creek. The trail was peaceful, lined with tall trees and patches of wildflowers that still clung stubbornly to life despite the cooling weather. People in town often said it was one of the prettiest places to run, and the sisters agreed wholeheartedly. They would sometimes stop midway to admire the view or snap photos for inspiration. That day, however, nothing seemed unusual. They laughed, talked about their plans for the weekend, and dreamed aloud about the future. As hours passed, their parents began to worry. Breakfast grew cold on the table, and there was no sign of Emma or Claire. At first, they thought maybe the sisters had decided to extend their jog or visit a friend. But when evening fell and they still hadn't returned, panic set in. Richard, their father, drove along the trail in his car, calling out their names. Margaret, their mother, called every number she could think of, hoping for answers. Nothing. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek. Neighbors joined search parties, combing the woods with flashlights late into the night. The local police launched an investigation, interviewing anyone who might have seen the sisters that day. Yet no matter how hard they looked, there was no trace of Emma or Claire. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole. Days turned into weeks, and hope began to fade. The only clue ever found was a single running shoe belonging to Claire, discovered tangled in brambles near a less traveled part of the trail. Even that offered little comfort. It raised more questions than it answered. Who had taken the sisters? Had they been hurt? Were they even alive? For the Thompson family, the uncertainty was unbearable. Each unanswered question felt like a weight pressing down on them. Friends tried to offer support, but nothing could fill the void left by Emma and Claire's absence. What had started as a simple morning jog had become a mystery that would haunt the town and the family for years to come. As days turned into weeks without any sign of Emma and Claire, the once peaceful town of Willow Creek found itself gripped by an unsettling mix of fear and speculation. The disappearance of the Thompson sisters wasn't just a personal tragedy for their family. It became a shared burden that weighed heavily on everyone who called the small town home. Conversations at the local cafe, the grocery store, and even school revolved around one question: what happened to Emma and Claire? The wooded trails where the sisters were last seen suddenly felt ominous instead of serene. Parents hesitated to let their children play outside, and joggers avoided the paths altogether. People whispered about possible explanations. Had they been kidnapped? Attacked by an animal? Or had they simply wandered off course and gotten lost? No theory seemed far-fetched enough to explain how two healthy young women could vanish without a trace. Detective Laura Hayes, who was relatively new to the force at the time, took charge of the case with determination. She spent countless hours retracing the sisters' steps, interviewing locals, and searching every inch of the forest. But despite her efforts, leads quickly dried up. The only tangible evidence remained Claire's running shoe, which offered no clear answers. It was frustrating, Not just for the police, but for the entire community. Everyone wanted resolution, yet nothing came. Rumors began to swirl like wildfire. Some claimed they'd seen strangers lurking near the trail around the time of the disappearance. Others pointed fingers at Daniel Graves, a reclusive handyman who lived close to the area. He kept mostly to himself, rarely interacting with neighbors, and his quiet demeanor made him an easy target for suspicion. When questioned, Graves denied knowing anything about the sisters, insisting he'd been working elsewhere that morning. Without concrete proof, investigators had no choice but to move on. Meanwhile, posters of Emma and Claire appeared everywhere, in shop windows, on telephone poles, and along the very trails they loved to run. Volunteers organized search parties combing through dense thickets and rocky outcrops, calling out their names in the faint hope of hearing a response. Helicopters buzzed overhead, scanning the landscape from above. Yet, all these efforts yielded nothing but silence. For Detective Hayes, the lack of progress gnawed at her. This wasn't just another case, it was deeply personal now. She couldn't shake the image of the Thompsons sitting at their kitchen table, clutching each other's hands while trying to hold on to hope. Every unanswered question felt like a failure on her part. Still, life eventually moved forward. For most people, anyway. The initial frenzy of searches slowed down, replaced by a somber acceptance that the sisters might never be found. But beneath the surface, the mystery lingered. Families grew more cautious, locking doors and keeping watch over their loved ones. Children learned the story of Emma and Claire as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fragile safety can feel. And though the town tried to return to normalcy, there was always an undercurrent of unease, a silent acknowledgement that something dark had touched Willow Creek. 16 years later, when construction workers stumbled upon human remains buried deep in the woods, the shockwave rippled through the town once again. For so long, the disappearance of Emma and Claire had been a cold case, relegated to old newspaper clippings and faded memories. Now it was raw and real all over again. As news spread, people gathered in hushed groups, sharing stories and recalling details they thought they'd forgotten. The past wasn't done with Willow Creek, or with the Thompson family, just yet. The disappearance of Emma and Claire left a gaping hole in the Thompson family that never fully healed. Life, once filled with laughter and warmth, became a shadow of what it used to be. Margaret, their mother, was hit hardest. She had always been the heart of the household, kind, nurturing, and endlessly supportive. But after her daughters vanished, she withdrew into herself. Days turned into months, then years, and Margaret stopped attending social gatherings or even stepping outside unless absolutely necessary. Her eyes, once bright with joy, dulled with sorrow. Friends tried to reach out, bringing casseroles and offering words of comfort, but nothing could ease the ache of losing two daughters without knowing why. Richard, the father, handled his grief differently. Where Margaret retreated inward, Richard channeled his pain into action. He became a tireless advocate for families dealing with missing persons cases, traveling across the state to speak at events and raise awareness. "No one should feel as helpless as we did," he often said during interviews. His voice carried both conviction and anguish, resonating deeply with others who had faced similar tragedies. Yet despite his outward strength, those closest to him noticed how his hands trembled when he thought no one was watching, or how quiet he grew on autumn mornings, the time of year when Emma and Claire disappeared. For Jake, the youngest sibling, growing up under the shadow of such loss shaped him in ways he didn't fully understand until much later. At just 8 years old, when his sisters went missing, he remembered them vividly. Emma helping him build model airplanes, Claire teaching him how to draw trees with sweeping branches. Their absence loomed large over his childhood, leaving him with unanswered questions that haunted his dreams. Had they called for help? Did they suffer? Was there something he could have done to prevent their disappearance? These thoughts gnawed at him, especially during milestones like graduations and birthdays, moments when he wished more than anything that Emma and Claire were there to celebrate with him. As the years passed, the house itself seemed to echo with memories. Emma's notebook still sat untouched on a shelf in her old bedroom, pages filled with half-finished stories and scribbled ideas. Claire's easel stood dusty in the corner, brushes stiff with dried paint. The family avoided these rooms most of the time, unable to face the reminders of what they'd lost. But sometimes, late at night, Margaret would sit in Claire's room, holding one of her paintings close to her chest as if trying to absorb some piece of her daughter's spirit. Richard, too, found himself drawn to Emma's desk, flipping through her notes as though hoping to find answers hidden between the lines. Despite the pain, the Thompsons refused to give up entirely. Every anniversary of the sisters' disappearance, they held a small vigil in the backyard, lighting candles and sharing stories about Emma and Claire. Neighbors joined them, bringing flowers and mementos to honor the girls' memory. It was a bittersweet tradition, a way to keep their names alive while acknowledging the void they left behind. Still, life moved forward in its uneven way. Jake grew into adulthood, finishing school and starting a career, though he always felt a lingering sadness. Margaret eventually returned to volunteering at the local library, finding solace in helping others, and Richard continued his advocacy work, driven by the hope that no family would endure the same heartbreak they had. Through it all, they clung to one another, united by love and loss, waiting, sometimes against all odds, for the day when the truth might finally come to light. 16 years after Emma and Claire vanished, the Thompson family had almost resigned themselves to the idea that they might never know what happened to their beloved daughters. The once sharp pain of loss had dulled into a constant, heavy ache, but the question still lingered. What had become of Emma and Claire? Why had they disappeared so suddenly, leaving no trace behind? For Margaret, Richard, and Jake, these unanswered questions were like an open wound that refused to heal. Then, out of nowhere, came a discovery that would change everything. In 2023, a construction crew working on expanding a highway near Willow Creek stumbled upon something chilling. Buried deep in the forest, just off an old dirt path rarely used by anyone, were human remains. At first glance, it was impossible to tell who or what they belonged to, but as the workers carefully uncovered fragments of clothing and jewelry, nearby, a wave of unease spread through the team. One worker immediately called the police, sensing this wasn't just another abandoned site, it was something far more significant. When investigators arrived, they quickly realized the potential connection to the long, cold case of the missing sisters. Fragments of fabric matched descriptions of the running outfits Emma and Claire wore on the day they disappeared. A delicate bracelet found among the items had been handmade by Claire herself, a detail only the Thompsons could confirm. DNA testing soon followed, and within days the results confirmed the unthinkable. The remains belonged to Emma and Claire Thompson. The news hit the town like a thunderclap. 16 years of uncertainty, speculation, and heartache now had a grim answer. For the Thompson family, it was both devastating and relieving. Finally, they knew. Emma and Claire weren't lost somewhere, waiting to be found. They were gone. Though the confirmation brought fresh waves of grief, it also reignited a fierce determination to uncover the truth behind their deaths. Detective Laura Hayes, now retired but still haunted by the unsolved case, returned to assist with the reopened investigation. Over the years, she'd kept a file tucked away in her home office, filled with notes, photos, and theories she'd revisited countless times. When she heard about the discovery, she felt a mix of emotions: relief that progress was finally being made, but also anger that justice had taken so long. "This isn't over," she told herself firmly. "Not until we know exactly what happened." With modern forensic technology and renewed focus, investigators dove back into the evidence. They re-examined old interviews, reviewed grainy security footage from nearby businesses, and scoured maps of the area for overlooked clues. One name kept resurfacing during discussions: Daniel Graves, the reclusive handyman who lived near the trail where the sisters disappeared. At the time, he had been questioned briefly, but dismissed due to lack of evidence. Now, however, his role in the story seemed worth revisiting. As word spread about the discovery, people in Willow Creek began sharing memories of Emma and Claire again. Old posters that had faded under sun and rain were replaced with fresh ones, adorned with flowers, and heartfelt messages. Vigils were held not just by the Thompsons but by neighbors, friends, and even strangers touched by the tragedy. It was as if the entire town collectively paused to mourn and to demand answers. For the Thompson family, this moment marked a turning point. After 16 years of living in limbo, they finally had closure. But closure wasn't enough. They wanted justice. And as detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the final chapter of Emma and Claire's story, one thing became clear. The mystery of what happened that autumn morning was closer than ever to being solved. With the discovery of Emma and Claire's remains, the investigation took on a new urgency. Detective Laura Hayes, her determination unwavering despite years away from the force, led the renewed efforts to uncover the truth. Modern forensic tools allowed investigators to analyze evidence in ways that weren't possible back in 2007. Every scrap of fabric, every fragment of jewelry, and even soil samples from the burial site were meticulously examined. The goal was clear: find out who was responsible for the sisters' deaths. As the team dug deeper into old case files, one name kept surfacing: Daniel Graves. He had been questioned briefly during the initial investigation, but dismissed due to lack of evidence. Back then, he claimed he'd been working alone on his property, clearing fallen trees after a storm. But now, with fresh eyes and advanced methods, detectives began to see inconsistencies in his story. For starters, why had he never mentioned seeing or hearing anything unusual along the trail where the sisters disappeared? And why did several neighbors recall him acting strangely around that time, making late-night trips into the woods with tools and supplies? Armed with these questions, investigators decided it was time to revisit Daniel Graves. Now an elderly man in his late 70s, Graves lived a quiet life on the outskirts of Willow Creek, far removed from the bustling town center. When detectives arrived at his modest home, they found him frail and slow-moving, his hands gnarled with age. At first he seemed confused by their visit, claiming he didn't know anything about those girls. But as they pressed him with details uncovered through their investigation, specifics only someone involved would know, his demeanor shifted. Graves grew agitated, his voice trembling as he denied any involvement. Yet cracks began to show in his carefully constructed facade. Detectives noticed how his eyes darted toward the floor whenever certain questions arose, and how his answers became increasingly vague. Finally, under intense scrutiny, he confessed, not to murder but to covering up an accident. According to Graves, he had been driving his truck down a narrow dirt road near the trail when he struck the sisters unexpectedly. Panicked and fearing the consequences, he hid their bodies instead of reporting the incident. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he muttered, his voice heavy with regret. "It was an accident. I didn't know what to do." His confession sent shockwaves through the town. Many people struggled to reconcile the image of the reclusive handyman with the idea of him committing such a grave act. While some felt anger toward his cowardice, others believed his advanced age and apparent remorse made traditional punishment meaningless. Still, the Thompson family finally had answers, or so they thought. Detectives weren't entirely convinced by Graves's version of events. Why had he buried the sisters so far off the beaten path? Why had he never come forward, even anonymously, to ease the family's suffering? These lingering doubts prompted further investigation. Investigators revisited the scene of the crash, analyzing tire tracks and damage patterns on Graves's old truck, which he still owned. They also spoke to more witnesses, including former neighbors who recalled hearing loud noises coming from the woods that fateful morning. As pieces of the puzzle slowly fell into place, one thing became clear. While Graves' confession provided some closure, there were still unanswered questions. Was he truly guilty of nothing more than a tragic mistake, or was there more to the story? For the Thompson family, justice meant not just holding someone accountable, but understanding the full truth behind the loss of Emma and Claire. And though progress had been made, the final chapter of this heartbreaking tale was yet to be written. Daniel Graves' confession sent ripples through Willow Creek, but it also left many questions unanswered. For the Thompson family, hearing That their daughters had died in a tragic accident brought some measure of closure, but it wasn't enough. They needed to understand why Graves had hidden their bodies and whether his story was entirely truthful. The legal process began almost immediately, with prosecutors charging him with manslaughter and obstruction of justice. Yet, as the case unfolded, opinions in the town were divided. Graves appeared in court looking frail and defeated, leaning heavily on a cane as he shuffled to the stand. His lawyer argued that his client was an old man who had already suffered greatly, both physically and emotionally, over the years. He has lived with this guilt for 16 years, the attorney said. Is prison really where he belongs now? Some in the courtroom nodded sympathetically, while others sat stiffly, unconvinced by appeals for leniency. Margaret, Richard, and Jake watched silently from the front row, their faces unreadable masks of pain and resolve. During the trial, new evidence emerged that painted a more complicated picture of what had happened that morning. Investigators revealed that tire tracks found near the burial site matched those of Graves' truck, confirming he had been there after the accident. However, they also discovered signs of deliberate effort, tools used to dig the shallow grave, twigs strategically placed to conceal it, that suggested premeditation rather than panic. This raised doubts about whether the collision itself was truly accidental or if something more sinister had occurred. Witness testimonies added another layer of complexity. A neighbor recalled seeing Graves acting erratically the day after the sisters disappeared, muttering to himself and pacing outside his house late at night. Another claimed he'd heard raised voices coming from the woods earlier that morning, though no one could confirm who else might have been present. These accounts fueled speculation that Graves may not have acted alone, or worse, that he had intended harm all along. Despite these uncertainties, the prosecution focused on the facts. Graves admitted to striking Emma and Claire and hiding their bodies instead of seeking help. Whether out of fear, selfishness, or malice, his actions had robbed the Thompsons of 16 years of peace. The jury ultimately convicted him of manslaughter and obstruction of justice, sentencing him to several years in prison. Given his age and declining health, however, it was unlikely he would serve much time behind bars. For the Thompson family, the verdict offered mixed emotions. On one hand, they felt vindicated knowing someone had finally been held accountable for their daughter's deaths. On the other hand, the truth remained incomplete. Had Graves acted alone? Was it truly an accident? Or was there more to the story? These lingering questions weighed heavily on them, even as they tried to focus on healing. In the months following the trial, the family worked closely with local authorities to ensure Emma and Claire's memory would live on. They collaborated to create a memorial park along the trail where the sisters loved to jog, a place filled with benches, trees, and plaques engraved with their names. It became a symbol of hope and resilience, drawing visitors from across the region who came to pay their respects. Though justice had been served in part, the Thompsons knew true peace would take time. For 16 years, they had carried the weight of unanswered questions. Now armed with fragments of the truth, they began the long journey toward acceptance, not forgetting Emma and Claire, but honoring their lives in ways that inspired others to cherish their own loved ones. The conviction of Daniel Graves marked a turning point for the Thompson family, but it wasn't the end of their journey. Justice had been served in the eyes of the law, yet the emotional scars ran far deeper than any verdict could heal. Margaret, Richard, and Jake knew that moving forward didn't mean forgetting Emma and Claire. It meant finding ways to honor their memory while learning to live without them. And so they turned their attention to creating something meaningful out of tragedy. One of the first steps was transforming the wooded trail where Emma and Claire loved to jog into a memorial park. The idea came from Jake, who felt inspired by his sister's love for nature and art. They wouldn't want this place to feel sad, he told his parents one evening. They'd want it to be beautiful, full of life. Together, the family worked with local authorities and volunteers to design a space that reflected Emma and Claire's personalities. Walking paths wound through lush greenery, benches offered quiet spots for reflection, and murals painted by local artists depicted scenes of running trails, sunsets, and wildflowers, the things the sisters cherished most. At the heart of the Yao Park stood a large stone monument engraved with the words, "Forever loved, forever missed." Beneath it were smaller plaques sharing stories about Emma and Claire, how Emma dreamed of becoming a writer, how Claire saw beauty in everything she painted, and how their bond inspired everyone around them. Visitors often left flowers, notes, or small mementos at the base of the monument, turning it into a living tribute. The dedication ceremony for the park brought the entire town together. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers gathered under a clear blue sky, just like the ones Emma and Claire used to admire during their jogs. Margaret spoke first, her voice trembling but steady as she thanked everyone for their support over the years. "Emma and Claire were light," she said, pausing to wipe away tears. "And though we can't bring them back, we can keep their light shining through this place." Richard followed, speaking passionately about the importance of remembering those who were lost. He encouraged others to cherish their loved ones and never take time together for granted. Finally, Jake stepped up, clutching a sketchbook filled with drawings he'd made of his sisters. "I miss you every day," he said softly, looking toward the trees as if they could hear him. "But I'm proud of what we've built here. I hope it helps people remember not just your names, but your spirit." As the ceremony ended, visitors walked slowly through the park, taking in its beauty and significance. Children played near the murals, couples strolled hand in hand along the paths, and elderly residents sat on benches, reminiscing about happier times. It was exactly what Emma and Claire would have wanted, a place alive with joy and connection. For the Thompsons, the park became a sanctuary. They visited often, finding comfort in watching others enjoy the space. Margaret began volunteering there, helping maintain the flower beds and organizing community events. Richard continued his advocacy work, using the park as a gathering spot for families affected by similar tragedies. And Jake found solace in creating art inspired by his sisters, donating pieces to fundraisers that supported missing persons organizations. Though the pain of losing Emma and Claire never fully faded, the Thompsons learned to carry it differently. They focused on celebrating the lives their daughters had lived instead of dwelling solely on how they were taken. In doing so, they discovered a kind of peace, not the absence of grief, but the ability to live alongside it. The memorial park stood as a testament to their resilience, ensuring that Emma and Claire's legacy would endure for generations to come. Years after the discovery of Emma and Claire's remains, life in Willow Creek began to feel different, not because the pain had disappeared, but because the town had found a way to carry it forward. The memorial park became more than just a tribute to the sisters. It evolved into a symbol of hope, resilience, and unity for everyone who visited. Families brought their children to play among the trees. Runners traced the trails where Emma and Claire once jogged, and artists set up easels to capture the beauty of the landscape. What had once been a place shrouded in mystery and sadness was now alive with laughter, creativity, and connection. For Jake, the youngest Thompson sibling, the park became a source of inspiration. He channeled his grief into action, dedicating himself to preserving green spaces and supporting young artists, two passions he shared with his sisters. His own artwork gained recognition, often featuring themes of nature and memory. One of his most celebrated pieces was a mural at the entrance of the park, a vibrant depiction of Emma and Claire running side by side, their figures blending seamlessly into the surrounding forest. Beneath the mural were the words, "Run free," a phrase Jake remembered Claire saying whenever she encouraged him to chase his dreams. Visitors frequently stopped to take photos in front of the mural, touched by its message of freedom and perseverance. Margaret and Richard also found new purpose in honoring their daughter's legacy. Margaret spent her days tending to the park's flower gardens, finding solace in nurturing something beautiful from the ground up. She often greeted visitors with warm smiles, sharing stories about Emma and Claire with anyone who asked. "They loved this trail," she'd say, pointing toward the winding path. "It's fitting that people still use it today." Richard, meanwhile, continued advocating for families affected by missing persons cases, traveling across the country to speak at conferences and raise awareness. Though his work was demanding, it gave him a sense of fulfillment, knowing he was helping others navigate the same heartache he had endured. The annual vigil held in Emma and Claire's honor grew larger each year, drawing crowds not only from Willow Creek but from neighboring towns as well. People lit candles, shared memories, and released balloons into the sky, filling the air with color and light. For the Thompsons, these gatherings offered a chance to reconnect with the community and celebrate the positive impact their daughters had made on so many lives. It was a reminder that even in death, Emma and Claire's presence could inspire kindness, courage, and love. As time passed, the details of the tragedy began to fade for some, replaced by the enduring image of two sisters who brought joy to those around them. Yet for the Thompson family, the memories remained vivid. They didn't need photographs or keepsakes to recall Emma's laughter or Claire's infectious energy. They carried those moments within them, woven into the fabric of their everyday lives. And while they would always miss their daughters, deeply they found comfort in knowing that Emma and Claire's story hadn't ended with their deaths. Instead, it lived on through the park, the art, and the countless lives they touched. On quiet evenings, when the sun dipped low over the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jake liked to sit on one of the park benches overlooking the trail. He imagined Emma jotting down ideas for her next story and Claire sketching the scenery on her canvas. In those moments, he felt closest to them, not as tragic figures frozen in time, but as vibrant individuals whose spirits continued to shape the world around them. 16 years earlier, the disappearance of Emma and Claire had left an unfillable void in the hearts of their family and community. But now, as the park thrived and their story inspired others, the Thompsons realized they weren't saying goodbye. They were simply finding new ways to keep Emma and Claire close. Their love had transformed grief into something meaningful, proving that even in the face of unimaginable loss, life could still bloom in unexpected ways.